All right. So,
Well,
Christopher, hi.
yes, sir.
We have chatted a bit, but not too much. So, presumably, this is going to end up on one of, if not both of our YouTube channels. So, for my audience, hi, this is Christopher from a channel called The Shared Story, which has some really interesting content regarding, the chakras and myth weaving, I guess. Actually, I probably shouldn't be the one trying to summarize here. I should probably leave that to you. So, on that note,
Yeah,
yeah, tell us a little bit about the shared
yeah.
story. What's the rundown of that?
Well, yeah. So it started. I guess the main point of the whole thing was just, I was a film student, spent a lot of time writing screenplays and narratives and that kind of thing, and then and I was a pretty hardcore atheist. I would say I was sort of a militant atheist, maybe a little bit. I sort of, my parents were not religious. My dad sort of gave me the impression, he's sort of a, yeah, I can't talk about that. It's one of these things where I guess to sum it up, I was raised to think that religion was kind of stupid, you know. And I really didn't, I was sort of a secular materialist growing up, um, became sort of a hedonist, a nihilist hedonist, maybe was the best way to describe it. Um, and although I was definitely curious and I was definitely looking for answers and I was sort of asking big questions about the universe and that kind of stuff. So I was super high in openness and very interested in exploring new ideas and that kind of thing. And let's see, 1993, I was about 19, just starting college. I had this crazy dream that seemed to predict the future in some way, and it was unlike any other dream I've ever had, and it really just stuck with me for 20 years. And but I didn't take it that seriously because without telling the entire story, I mean, I could tell the entire story. It's quite long, and I've never really put it on the Shared Story website, on the Shared Story channel. But to make a long story short, 2013, basically 20 years to the month. I don't know if it was to the day because I don't remember the exact date, but I know it was January 2013. I had sort of spiraled out. I had spent probably a good solid 8 to 10 years in sort of a crippling depression. I was angry. I was anxious all the time. I was sort of miserable, um, sort of borderline functional alcoholic, I would say. Um, and then one night in 2013, I had this. I think anybody that goes through depression knows, like, maybe once a month or once every couple months, you go through like the pit of despair where you're sort of just at the bottom. And I started thinking, like, well, where did all this go wrong, and why? How did my life end up the way it did? And I suddenly saw what that dream had tried to show me in the future as being accurate. So it was like that night I sort of had this overnight metamorphosis where, I realized that the dream was real or that it was trying to tell me something. And it took me a few months to really, it took me, it was like it went in these stages. First it was like the first 3 days, and then it was the first 3 months. And then it went in these parts, these little trinities. And, one of the first people I came across, so I started researching other experiences like this. Like, how do you have this overnight transformation, just by being told, basically, by the universe that yes, religion is real. There's some element of religion that is trying to describe reality, and I think we all kind of agree in this space that, like, yeah, like religion has gone off the rails. It needs to live in the moment. It needs to live in the present, and that's what this experience gave me. And it was so mind blowing and such a relief, because I guess I had a lot of death anxiety, and as most people do, I guess, and without some kind of narrative for it to all make sense, that was something that was, I think, driving a lot of my depression, was just the nihilism of existence and just the meaninglessness of it all. And once my life had meaning, everything just changed. And I was going to say, like, one of the first people I came across was Eckhart Tolle, because I was trying to share this story with my friends, and most of them were not interested. And I have one friend who was spiraling out, and I was desperately trying to help him with his life. And I'm telling him all this stuff that, it's like I got a download that night of all this information. This that was a it was a spiritual type of information that I just suddenly had access to. And I'm sharing all this stuff with him, and he looks at me and he says, "Bro, you sound like Eckhart Tolle." And I'm like, "Who the hell is Eckhart Tolle?" So then I go look him up, and he was the first sort of guru type that I came across on the internet. That he had such a similar experience. He had like this overnight awakening, and while the character of our awakenings was very different, it was still the same result and the same sort of monumental transformation. Um, and then I have another friend who was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, who was kicked out, when he was in his late teens for not living right, and so as I'm going through this process, I'm talking to him a lot about this stuff, and I'm saying these things, and he's like, "Bro, that's right out of Scripture," and he's, he knows the Bible forwards and backwards. And he was also one of these guys that, even when he was a witness, he researched other, super high in openness. So he was out there like researching all this stuff. He's got more of a knowledge akin to, I think, what you have, comparatively. Like I still feel like a beginner in a lot of ways in terms of reading other people's work, because I kind of just immediately started to get into my own formulation of what all of this meant to me. And part of that was this thing that I started calling the chart, which really just came out of me trying to share this with my friend Dean. And at some point, he kind of, I say it in one of the videos. He says, he just hands me a pen and he says, "Dude, draw what you saw." And I can't draw very well, so I just drew these three circles on this page, and I put these three, there were these three objects that I saw in this dream, which I could go into. But I drew these three circles. I showed him the circles, and I said, "This is what I saw, man. I'm not going to draw it for you." And it was sort of just a joke. And then I put the paper aside. And then maybe a couple months later, I'm just kind of I'm cleaning up or whatever, and I come across this paper, and I realized that that's a trinity. And then that started me down this whole rabbit hole of like, why are trinities and all these different religions, and then that is how the chart was sort of born. And it just, and I had a graphic design background, and so a lot of it came pretty easy to me to like put it in the computer and start messing around with these things. And then it just became this weird project of like trying to see like how much stuff can I correlate here. um, and I guess the last sort of step of that was the big five personality traits. And once they fit into this thing so perfectly that I that was kind of when I realized, like, dude, this is, of all the narratives that I've ever tried to write, like the narrative of the hero's journey of like the atheist who's struggling, who then wakes up, was such a compelling narrative. And I was like, I was in that mode of like, um, thinking that I could help people, which we could talk about that too, which is a whole problem in and of itself. And it had to be, I had to face certain things about that with the ego and like all that kind of stuff. But
Let me interject something here real
yeah, please,
quick. I have
please
a
do.
question for you.
Yeah, yeah.
So, how much of this narrative, perchance, happened around the beginning of the year 2020?
Well, that was a totally separate thing. All of this entire, I'll call it a 3 month. I basically
Hmm.
said like there was a 3 month period where I was having like a throat chakra awakening or whatever, and that was the period between January 2013 and March 2013.
Hmm.
And it's funny, I was listening to Owen and Jonathan, I think, on one of their talks, and they were sort of joking about like, hey, maybe 2012 really was like some turning point. And I know for me, absolutely, like 2013 marked like the beginning of my life in a lot of ways. And I was 39 at that point. Within 3 months of that awakening, I met my this a woman who's now my wife. You know, we have two kids. Like my life has sort of blossomed into this thing that I just never thought possible, I guess.
Yeah, I was
Um,
asking about
yeah.
2020 because there I know many people. You mentioned you described it as this kind of download that happened.
Hmm.
A
Yeah.
lot of people experience things like that for some reason around that time frame in particular. And so
Okay.
I was wondering if, you know, there's any correlation there, but
There is
um
in a physical sense because
mm,
2020, you know, I owned a cafe in Philly for almost 20 years, you know, until 2020 is when I decided that I had to leave. And that was like a big metamorphosis too. You know, it was like I had my wife and two kids living in this, you know, a nice apartment for Philly standards, but still a little apartment in Philly. And that's when we decided to leave. And so I've been out 4 years now, and that obviously, like, yeah, that was a huge transformation too, just because of the fact that I really thought I was going to live the rest of my life in Philly. I never thought I would ever leave, and um, and now I've been out in the burbs basically for the last 4 years, and I'll never look back. And you know, of course, there's some aspects that I miss about city life, but I'm done, man, and that, you know, that's a fun, interesting story in itself. But that has a lot more to do with like politics a little bit and the COVID thing, and you know, I'm sure you can relate. I mean, everybody I think kind of went through a crucible during that period,
right, yeah.
and I certainly did. And you know, um, yeah. So, but yeah, the 2012 thing was kind of interesting because yeah, like that is that is the time. I mean, January 2013, man, like it all changed, and I've heard a lot of other people talk about that period too, you know, and having similar experiences around that time, and I like the, you know, I like when things line up numerically. And you know, I did move 7 years after after that
Hmm.
awakening in 2020. Crazy times, you know.
And that would have been I'm like lining it up right now in my head. I'm like, okay, 7 years before that would have been blah blah blah, and then 7 years before that would have been like 1999, which was when The Matrix came out. And so, okay, but we're not going there.
Yeah.
Um, um, okay, yeah. So like, I suppose I should just interject a bit of my story here.
Yeah,
So
I was
I
curious where you got into all, you know, I know you have kind of a chart thing too, and I was curious if that came about in similar circumstances or
not quite.
okay.
So I really began my metaphysical quest, let's call it, when I was, geez, probably like 14 or 15 years old, maybe even a little younger than that. I mean, I grew up in a very, very rural place, to such an extent that I don't think the word rural really does it justice. Like I was born and raised in the middle of nowhere. I mean, just like in the forest, right? Like not
Mhm.
like little small town Americana, but just like completely isolated. Yeah, I was extremely lonely. I was extremely depressed, and I had nothing better to do than read, and that's what I did, by golly, you know. And as I got older, I kind of transitioned from more sci-fi fantasy type stuff, which I was into when I was like in my early teens, more into things like philosophy. And by the time I was about 15, that was kind of the beginning of my new atheist phase, because that was around the time I discovered the science and started, really looking to that as this kind of beacon of hope and rationality. And moreover, it was performing a very important psychological function for me as well, because it was allowing me to kind of differentiate myself from the atmosphere of like evangelical Southern Baptist Protestantism, which I was immersed in, right? And so that was a big part of it too. But to make a very long story short, that phase lasted a long time in a sense, but in another sense it didn't, because I mean it was about 7 years, I suppose. No, 6 years altogether, something like that. It was a while. But by the time I was 21, I had already completely given up on that, because it my problem with the new atheist worldview was not that it made me depressed or that I found it unfulfilling, really. If I had stuck with it for long enough, then presumably I would have ran into that wall sooner or later. But my problem with it was really it was just that it didn't work, because it was never enough for me to be like, okay, this makes sense, these are the facts, blah blah blah, and just go about my life, right? I am way too obsessive compulsive for that, and so I wanted to really dig into the epistemology of science. Like, okay, if the science has the truth, then what is truth? What is science? How does this work? Like, what or the inner nuts and bolts that are at work in mediating between human beliefs and the world. And so this got me into the logical positivists and Wittgenstein's early work and Karl Popper's logic of scientific discovery, and then Thomas Kuhn, and then blah blah blah. And I was just kind of on this endless quest to find some kind of rock solid understanding of science that I felt was adequately grounding for really what I already believed in. And then just out of nowhere, I discovered Friedrich Nietzsche.
Right.
And uh, it's these things seem unrelated, because Nietzsche is kind of known as an atheist himself, or at the very least, kind of anti-Christian. But for me, Nietzsche was like a sledgehammer to the new atheist worldview, because he just, I mean, just unflinchingly, just like turned the mirror around and showed me like, hey, this is like here's the psychological reasons why you like this and why it appeals to you, and here's all the really dark, messy parts of yourself that are actually motivating this. And I was like, oh, he's right. Yeah.
Right.
There was no denying it. I was like, oh, okay, this is awkward. And then it was like, oh, okay, well, now what? Right. And so that
Yeah.
led me on a whole other trajectory through, oh, geez, Richard Rorty, Heidegger, Derrida, Deleuze, eventually Whitehead. It wouldn't be until, yeah, it was the summer of 2020, was when things really took a major turn. The time prior to that, so that would have been at least 5 or 6 years in between Nietzsche and then. That time had definitely opened me up a lot more to the possibility of seeing things in a kind of spiritualistic way or taking religion seriously, but I just kind of didn't. I just kind of didn't really see the appeal of it, really. I was much more concerned with really just other philosophical things. I was kind of in a bit of a postmodernist rabbit hole for a while there. That was a big part of it. But then during 2020, that was that was a major crisis for me. That was a period of time where I had just gotten out of a really, really bad relationship that had lasted about 2 years. I had completely lost myself, to make a very long story short. I was also drinking like a fish, so that was a big part of it. I finally get sober for the first time. I would there would be a couple of relapses and then getting sober again before I was finally out of the woods. But the first time I got sober, it was like um, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Just all like, people keep on using download. And I mean, yeah, that's
Yeah.
what it felt like. Like it was
Right.
just like all of a sudden, I was like, oh, there's literally like these circulating flows of consciousness which are connecting me with like the air and the trees and stuff. And like, I don't need to like I just see it. Like there wasn't any like rationalizing it or explaining it. It was just like, oh, there it is. How did I not notice this until just now, right? Like
Right.
and then right around that same time I discovered the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, and I'm not going to go on a big tangent about him, but basically he was kind of like the gatekeeper, as it were, the first step into this world of a much more explicitly metaphysical
Hmm.
look at philosophy, and philosophy that bridges into theology and esotericism and that kind of thing. And so since then, I've pretty much been down the rabbit hole this entire time, and it's
Yeah,
been
yeah.
a hell of a ride. So yeah,
Yeah, man. I can relate. And it's there's so many rabbit holes.
indeed there is. I mean, even now, I mean, it's like it's never ending. I mean, very recently, I've been absolutely obsessed with like the Zodiac. That's been kind of the new
Uh-huh.
thing that I've been
Okay.
taking a lot of interest in, and it is fascinating. Oh, but you did ask specifically about my the chromogram, right, with the planets and the
Right.
colors and all that. That's interesting
Hmm.
because that came about. I was studying astrology kind of in the background, but I learned about the German philosopher, well, more like Renaissance man. He kind of did everything, but Johann von Goethe,
Hmm.
his color theory that he developed, which is absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. And I was learning about his stuff, and I realized like, oh, well, if you just, set things up in a way that kind of accords with what Goethe is talking about, and then you just set up like, okay, the sun is yellow, and then the moon can be
Right.
blue, and then I just started plugging the planets in, and then it was like, oh, like this seems like not only does it make sense, but like it actually shows me things that I didn't even notice before, right? And that's where you start to think like, oh, this is real, isn't it, right?
I had the exact same experience
Yeah.
with my chart too. Yeah. It's pretty wild. But interestingly, like I kind of came at the chart from the back end in the sense that, I had this map from my dream, and then it was just a map. So that was already sort of created. And when I started looking at things, I started realizing that other people had already correlated a lot of this stuff. So a lot of what my chart is really just um, like the only thing that I guess that's truly unique maybe about it, unless there, it could be out there obviously, but I haven't seen it, is just the arrangement of the chakras, um, and with the heart being in the center and the crown being on the outside. Um, but the rest of it, I was just plugging in what people had already said. Like I don't necessarily know why the platonic solids are correlated the way they are, and I'm not sure why. The astrological sign, like I put the zodiac around the outside and I did all these things, but I'm not clear on exactly why. The only things I was clear on was the things I saw in my dream, and I was just able to kind of just plug these things in. Um, So yeah, like, and I've been very curious about like exploring it with other people who know more about this stuff than I do because people are going to see different things in it,
Hmm.
and as you're saying that, like I did spend the last week or so like um, because you and Jonathan are both into tarot. I just for fun, like I was like, all right, let me see. I tried to do this, whatever 7 or so years ago, and I kind of thought, well, there's some correlations there. And I'd also gone through this process of like trying to force things to correlate that didn't necessarily work. Like I took the Kabbalah and I put the Kabbalah in there and I kind of was trying to look for correlations. And I really didn't find a lot that was compelling. And so, certain things kind of fell by the wayside. And the tarot cards were one of those things that I did some experiments with. And I felt that, like, once I felt like I understood what was happening with tarot cards, I kind of just left it behind, and I just moved on. But I don't know if you want to do a quick screen share here.
Yeah, totally. Go for it.
Um, oh,
There
sure.
we go.
There we go. Okay. So clearly I've been playing with these tarot images.
Hmm.
And then I just started looking at like, and again, this is what other people correlated them with. Like I don't know why the Wheel of Fortune is correlated with Jupiter. And I don't, I don't know. I can sort of try to intuit why some of these things line up the way they do just because of, other things that I've read or whatever. But of course, some of these things are going to correlate because I guess what the tarot is doing and what the chart is trying to do and what your chart is trying to do is to, the way Jonathan put it, it's the object at the end of time. He referred to it as the teleological. I think it's Terence McKenna as the
Yeah.
teleological object at the end of time. And if tarot is doing what it says it's doing, which is breaking down all human activities into these 78 sort of variations, then of course yeah, you're going to be able to correlate these things because they're all trying to do the same thing. Whether or not it's of value to anyone is the question, I guess, um, and that's up to people to figure out. But there is something kind of elegant and interesting about the way, not just with the tarot cards, but just with the way the planets worked out. And I kind of wanted to get your take on a couple of these things because, like I said, I mean, I only correlated these because that's what most of the sort of esoteric literature was saying about how they should be correlated. So, I put Venus here as this, I call it the equatorial axis. And I just thought that was cool that, like, Venus shows up at this harmonious equatorial axis, and Mars shows up at this, I call it it's like the axis of rotation, the rotational axis. And, between Mars and Venus is the Earth. And then if you look at the zodiac sign for the Earth, it is just like this crosshair, which I'm sort of seeing as the center of the chart and where everything's in harmony. Um, and I guess it's important to like just to like distinguish the difference between what I think of Earth as the element and Earth as the planet. Because to me, Earth as the element, at least how it exists in the chart, is really just talking about the processes of biology. So it's like it's dirt, but it's also the process of life itself. Whatever element is happening with biology, that's Earth. Whereas the planet Earth would actually be in the center of this because that's where we're all at, right? So
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because you can definitely look at Earth as an element and Earth as a planet as kind of the same but kind of different. It's
right,
interesting. With the planet Earth, I would say I would describe that as signifying convergence. Like it's the place where it all comes together, right?
you
As
know,
far as and that's exactly how the Neoplatonists and Aristotelians, the medieval Christians, all of them would have seen it that way, that the earth was the center in the sense that all of the different activities of the celestial spheres come together within the earth. And then elemental earth is a bit more specific, I guess you could say, and that it is that it is matter, but it's a specific modality of matter in
Yeah.
which there's this kind of completion, you could say. There's
Well, I
this
see it
fixity.
as like, metal
Hmm.
is down here, and that's to me is correlated with nothingness.
Hmm.
But it seems like, whatever's happening with Earth as an element, it is like it's it's matter that's just been embodied by spirit, I guess, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you've used the Chinese elements as well. That's very interesting because within excuse me, within the Chinese elemental framework, Earth kind of does something that is actually, I would say, kind of equivalent to what quintessence does, or ether, within the Western tradition, because essentially the way that Chinese alchemy works is that earth is like the central element, really, and then
Okay.
metal is drawn out of earth by fire. So it is
Mhm.
what is it? It's yin being drawn out of earth by yang, and
Okay.
then wood is the opposite of that. So wood is drawn out of earth by water. So that is yang being drawn out of earth by yin. So anyway, you can look at it like earth is in the middle, and then you've got fire and water, and then you've got wood and metal off to the sides. And so anyway, but quintessence kind of serves a similar purpose within within the Western system. And so sometimes it's occurred to me that maybe with the elemental earth in the Western system, it would make more sense to use a word like stone, right? Rather than earth, to kind of differentiate those. But I don't know. The ambiguity itself also sometimes has a kind of function. So either
Right. Yeah.
way. But yeah, with the heart chakra there in the middle, I like that as well, because the heart, the heart is interesting, with this relationship to, well, Christianity. First of all, the
Yeah.
heart is a very central symbolic significance there,
That was one of the
and
things that hit me about a lot of the things that Jesus was talking about. He's always talking about the heart,
mhm.
and I don't know how many times offhand he mentions it, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of going through that same process of like for me, it was really more about trying to understand like the relationship, and you might actually know more about this. Like why, like why does this? I call it the Star of David. I can't remember its technical name, but like why does the Star of David show up in Hindu mythology in this way in the heart chakra? And what's the connection between Judaism and Hinduism? Um, but once I started seeing, the upward triangle and the downward triangle and the relationship between the masculine and the feminine and all these things, like it just became obvious of like, and even when you look up like what the chakras mean in like the Hindu mythology, it really just comes down to like balance, harmony. Um, Sometimes people, will say like love or compassion, like all these different emotional states. But when I see the chart, that like this is the chart as we're seeing it, like this is somebody who's this is a moment of harmony. Like I think if you're not harmonious, you're not balanced well. It would look like this, and then your consciousness is sort of roaming around as it relates to like your temperament in terms of like the temp. I believe that we're probably born with a certain temperament, in terms of like the big five maybe, that then is modulated by our experiences, and that wherever we're born on this chart, we can go in, further into balance or further out of balance by our experiences. And then for me, it was like, the night of my awakening was like, boom, the heart chakra just pops up. And then suddenly I'm downloaded with all this knowledge, in terms of the void, that was how I saw my life. It was like, everything's meaningless. There's nothing, there's nothing and it doesn't matter. Nothing matters and all that kind of stuff. And so, to me, it's like, as we travel around this thing, the crown, the knowledge is what fills this void, I guess, is the way I think about it. And that, if everything's spiraling, then this chart, like the you know, you're kind of leveling up as you go through this process of accumulating knowledge and living in harmony. The crown chakra like pops up to make the to complete this journey from seeing back to being, where you're again sort of at rest, at peace, just being. There's no questions, there's nothing missing.
Very much like the hero's journey.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and that was another big key was I grew up watching Star Wars, like a
Hmm.
lot of us did, and it was a big deal for me as a kid. It kind of inspired me to go into film, and I was hanging out with my buddy Dean one day, and I started realizing, like, well, yeah, Princess Leia's got these buns on the side of her head. Could she be like, is that referencing the third eye chakra? And I knew that, supposedly George Lucas consulted with Joseph Campbell and all this stuff. And I don't know if you watched the Rescue the Princess video. Um, did you see that one?
I think so, but
It's
fill me in.
basically
I watched a few
it's
of your videos a long time ago, and then I
yeah.
recently started rewatching them, so I'm a little bit scrambled.
No, it's cool. The Rescue the Princess one is basically like I did a bunch of experiments. I was like hanging out with some people and recording our conversations. I was trying to find out like what form this YouTube channel was going to take because I knew I wanted to share this stuff, but I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to go. But once I sort of decoded the Star Wars story and was able to like correlate them with the chakras, that's how that Rescue the Princess episode was born. It was literally just like a conversation between me and my sister of me trying to explain the chart through the story of Star Wars, where Princess Leia is the mind, Han Solo is the body, Obi-Wan is the old wisdom from the past in terms of like correct action, because that's kind of how it's not just action. This is correct action. It's like the right thing to do in the moment. Um, you know, Princess Leia's got these two sidekicks, one of which C-3PO, and then we've got R2-D2 as Abel, which, I'd have to go into like why that makes sense. Maybe it already makes sense to you, but Han Solo's got these two sidekicks. One is Chewbacca, the emotional animal, and then we've got his ship, which is, sort of Cain-like in the sense that, to me, it's like all agriculture and technological advancement is sort of like, these rungs on the tree of knowledge trying to get us back into a harmonious state where we're at rest or at peace with nature or um, filling the void, so to speak. Um, and then obviously Darth Vader and the Emperor and that whole thing being the void and the thing that's missing and the or trying to bring order to the galaxy. And to me, nothingness is like I only correlate it with too much order because of the metallic relationship here. Like because to me it's like metal is, and I count crystals and stone in this same category of like physical objects that are so ordered that nothing can really happen inside there. Like, there might be some space, but it's pretty much as ordered as you can get. And as opposed to fire, which is like ultimate chaos, like it's just too much energy, too much chaos. And you kind of have this Goldilocks zone in the middle between all these other elements. But the Star Wars part of it was like, okay, now I know what I'm doing in trying to share this, and it was like after that, I wrote those first four videos probably in the span of like 6 months. And it did take 2 or 3 years, I think, to produce like the first batch. And then I got caught up with moving and all this stuff. And then and the channel wasn't getting that much love either. So I kind of just put it on the back burner. I thought, if people find this interesting, like it'll become obvious at some point and it'll either blow up or it won't. Yeah, I guess about a year ago, I did some experiments with TikTok, which we talked about, and one of those videos got like 700,000 views or something, and really kind of got me back into the saddle of like, yeah, I want to keep doing this, and people seem interested, and but yeah, it was like the first four videos kind of just fell out, and And I got to be honest, like I've struggled with where to go from there because the first four videos just came so easily, and it was kind of just me trying to put the download that I got into a format that I could present, to like, and it really was like just, can I get my sister? Can I help my sister with this? Can I help my friend with this? I look around and I see all these people suffering, and I do feel like it's because we lack a narrative to make sense of our suffering.
Yeah. Well, I got a number of things to touch upon here. I mean, one,
Yeah.
you've got the void down there at the bottom, which yeah, I mean, I've got something kind of similar with my chromogram
Hmm.
as well. You've got kind of like this light and darkness polarity, but and yeah, you can see that as kind of like the bottom of this descent.
Hmm.
This kind of I like to think of it as like a caterpillar kind of liquefying itself inside a
Oh man.
chrysalis before it becomes a butterfly, right? So there's this
Yeah. Yeah.
formlessness which
Hmm.
has to take hold before new form can come about. And so you have the descent into the darkness and then an ascent after that. What's interesting though, we in the West really have a propensity towards seeing nothingness as a negative, as a
Right.
bad thing. But um, within most Eastern traditions, that's not the case at all.
Right.
Um, the idea of emptiness, so sunyata within the Zen traditions, or anatta, no self, or just Brahman in general is you could say this kind of nothingness, which is simultaneously within this strange kind of paradox, also being itself.
Hmm.
And yeah, this is something that I feel the Eastern traditions have always been a lot more comfortable with than us in the West. And the reasons for that are very interesting, very worth exploring. But with regards to that in particular, yeah, there's this sense that nothingness is meaninglessness in the West. And there's a sense, I think, in which that is true, in the sense that meaning can also go through that kind of liquefaction process with the butterfly, right? Like meaning itself can dissolve into this kind of senselessness that we have to then put ourselves back together from. But simultaneously, on the other side of that, I think you can look back and see that nothingness, that the nothing itself is also this kind of generative thing. It's
Hmm.
necessary. It's actually omnipresent in the background of things, and you do see this in the Western esoteric and theological traditions as well. You see it within Meister Eckhart is a really great example of this. He was a 13th century Christian mystic and theologian from Germany, and he talks a lot about this kind of like divine nothingness. He calls it the groundless ground of being, the Ungrund, I believe is the German term for that. But anyway, and you even see it even earlier than that within these very early church fathers actually talking about this kind of like divine darkness as this kind
Hmm.
of formless nothingness that is a part of the divinity of God. And so it's interesting though that by and large, yeah, you do have this kind
Yeah.
of ambivalence towards this notion of like the void within the
Hmm.
West that isn't really there, or at least isn't nearly as pronounced within the Eastern traditions. So,
Yeah. I I've sort of struggled with that because yeah, like on one hand, when you're looking at the chart, the void is associated with these negative emotions like fear and anger. but I do see it as, like you said, as an integral part of the divine. Um, and I think we've talked about this before. Like, to me, it's sort of like God, or the result of nothing, of nothingness, is God. So, God sort of, I don't know if God comes out of nothingness or if they are always eternally, one thing. But when I see it in the physical sense, in terms of like the world that we live in, there is always something missing, um, in terms of how biology works. Like, even if it's just your breath, like, you have to take a breath every so many minutes or else
Hmm.
you're going to die. You have to drink some water, you need some food, you need sunlight, you need these things, you need harmony, you need communion, you need camaraderie. There's all these components to our lives that, where there's something missing. And I think that that's just a function of the physical realm. There's nothing inherently negative about it, but you see emotionally when people don't have what they need, they become fearful or they become angry. And so, to me, I guess that's the sort of correlation that I see in the chart. But I do agree with you. Like, it's not inherently negative. Like, I don't see um, you know I guess when I it's trying to simplify it to its ultimate, level of simplicity, it's like, God is the light in the darkness, and you can't have a light without a space to have, to illuminate within. And so, they are sort of a yin and yang.
I believe it
Sometimes I
was Saint Nicholas of Cusa, who was
Mhm.
another one of these like early Christian church fathers. He refers to God as a luminous darkness. So
Okay,
it's like light and darkness at the
that
same
sort
time.
of
I think it's
reminds me of,
very
yeah, yeah.
provocative. Yeah.
That kind of reminds me of Galahad's thing. I haven't like watched all of his material, but I did watch Contact 2020.
Hmm.
And I think I may have mentioned this to you, that I was writing the episode, the Over the Rainbow episode is sort of about, like, okay, so people have these weird experiences, they produce these cosmic grams, and as I'm writing the episode, some dudes, on TikTok sends me like, hey man, you should check out Galahad stuff. And so I watched Contact 2020, and I'm like, bro, like, that's crazy. And yeah, like, I do, it's kind of beautiful how all these experiences, we're describing these things in these with these subtle differences, and they're so colored by our own lives and personalities, but the synergy is so obvious. And
Hmm.
um as I've said to you before, I think, it's like I'm in a constant state of astonishment about all of this stuff. And I think that maybe is just a product of 39 years of atheism or whatever. But um,
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up Galahad because his most recent video, oh geez, what was it called? It was called Hidden Passage Theory. So he showed me that a while ago before it was made public, and I was talking to him about it, and I noticed in the video he was using this language that just, I mean, it sounded exactly like the language that I had used to describe pretty much the exact same thing. I forget the exact phrasing of it, but it was, I mean, it was almost like note for note, like we said it the exact same way. And I was like, did you like get that from me or like what? Like, and he said he didn't, and I totally
right.
believe him. But it's, I mean, it's remarkable that you would have
Yeah.
such a convergence like that because again, as usual, I'm not coming at this as much from this like place of having mystical experiences so much as like I'm up to my eyeballs in books and
Yeah.
like so the phrasing in particular that we were talking about there was something that I had gotten from the Swiss philosopher Jean Gebser, his text The Ever-Present Origin, which of course Galahad's never even heard of.
Okay. Right.
um but it's interesting that like I took that and like kind of rephrased it in a specific kind of way, and then Galahad he just pulled it
Poof.
out of the ether, I guess, and it was almost identical.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really interesting
I
that
had
seems
such
to
a,
be happening quite a lot,
yeah,
actually. There's a
I,
lot of
mhm.
movement in
I, s- I
in
s-
the air in that regard, it would seem.
I seem like I see it pretty much everywhere I look, you know.
Yeah.
I had so many interesting experiences like that too, with this quote that kind of came into my mind um, when I was doing the chart. You know, I was trying to I, one of the trinities that I sort of came up with was like this set of three axioms. You know, that I sort of felt like, well, you know, whatever was missing from my life during my atheistic phase, these axioms seem to cover that. And one of the axioms was that consciousness is the only real thing that exists, and nothing unreal exists is part of I think it's Journey Without Distance. It's like that there's like a sort of I don't want to call it a cult, but it's I can't remember the name of it. This is one of these sort of new age damn it, I'm drawing a blank on the name of this group. Doesn't matter, but you know, just the fact that yeah, I come up with this sort of idea, it just kind of pops into my head, and yeah, like I look back in the religious history, and it's everywhere. I mean, you know, and now even scientists are kind of saying, yeah, maybe consciousness is the ground of reality, and maybe it's not matter, you know, and I always love it when you know you kind of can have these independent revelations that then like spontaneously correlate. Like I've been looking for a word to describe the chart for, you know, years. And then I'm watching this Galahad video and he called it a cosmogram. And I was like,
Mm.
bro, that's it, you know.
Mhm.
And it's just so perfect and sort of, it's just, you know, a beautiful synergy of all these people, you know. And like I said, you know, it's happening everywhere. And I
Yeah, I
do
mean
sort of
there's
see
a
it as
lot of
like the,
stuff that I'm seeing within the sciences. I mean, there are lots of these figures, people like
Mhm.
Bernardo Kastrup and Donald Hoffman and a lot of these guys who are fighting for this kind of consciousness first interpretation of scientific findings, which it's interesting. I mean, I definitely think that that is an indication that the times are a changing. Harmonica solo insert, but anyway,
yeah,
nonetheless, I feel like I tend to have pretty much just as many disagreements with the consciousness first science guys as I have with the physicalist science guys. It's just they kind of turn it upside down. Like I very often, like with Donald Hoffman, for example, he loves this idea of like consciousness is a heads up display or like it's like a simulation it's and the thing is people hear that who don't really know much about the history of science and philosophy and they're like, oh wow, that's a cool new way of thinking
right,
about things.
right.
And I hear that and I'm like, yeah, that's Kant. He died like 250 years ago actually. But it's Kant, and it's a really ugly way of interpreting Kant because it's a way of interpreting Kant where it's like all you have access to is this screen,
Yeah.
basically, this simulation that your mind is somehow cooking up for
Hmm.
you, but you are your mind, but you're also making this depiction of the world that you don't have access to, but you have to depict it to you,
Right.
even though you're the thing doing the depicting. It makes sense, I promise. I promise it totally makes sense. But anyway, it's
Well,
a way of looking at these things that it makes sense until you think about it for a minute, but it's also really
yeah.
poisonous, I would say. It's actually very dangerous
Well,
because it implies that we never actually access anything beyond our own like private subjectivity. Like I never get to know what the tea actually tastes like. I never get to know what,
Yeah.
anything in the world is actually like, because all I ever encounter is this kind of simulation that my brain is spitting out. And
Yeah.
one of the main things I've been trying to push back against is that with Formscapes, and
Well, I
that's kind of been my, like, if there's one axe I've been grinding, it's that.
okay.
I think it's very important that we actually remain within a kind of metaphysical realism where it's like, no, it's not all just in our heads.
Yeah.
Like, the world itself actually does have color and taste and emotion and meaning. Like, these things are actually out there, not just within this black
Yeah.
box somewhere inside of us.
Well, I really do
So
see it
yeah.
as both things can be true, right? Like consciousness can be the ground in a yin yang sort of relationship with the material realm. Like I don't see how you remove one from the other, um, and even in the sense that if consciousness is the yin, let's say, and and matter is the yang, they each contain the other within them. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that goes any way to like addressing what you're talking about, but I do get what you're saying though, because the ultimate consciousness idea is like if consciousness is the ground, then it does appear that if it was just that you could view whatever we're experiencing as like a heads up display, but then that would ultimately be a very materialistic view of things because then, it's like you're saying, like you're not actually contacting the real world or the material world. You're just seeing a simulation of it. And I don't believe that either. Like I believe there is an objectively existent world out there and that, we are bodies within it. Um,
Well, I think this there's a temptation to fall into here, which is to see the physical as objective and the world of consciousness and experience and feeling as subjective. And so we use those words objective and subjective in such a way that it's like the physical is there for everybody. It's real for you and me, and it's there. And then the world of consciousness, then, and this is why science doesn't like consciousness. It's why it likes to kind of sweep consciousness under the rug because it has to account for the observer.
yeah,
Um, but there's a problem there too, and it's like there's this temptation to say that, well, if the smell of the candle might be different for me and different for you, then there is no like reality to smell at all. That's just in our heads, and there's no
yeah,
reality to scent outside
right.
of us. That's what I'm actually trying to push back against here. And
Well,
I'm really doing what Rudolf Steiner was trying to do with a lot of his work, which is to say that, like, just because there's variability here with the way that I might perceive something and the way you might perceive it, it's nonetheless the case that there is an objective reality there that is itself experiential, that itself is feeling effectively. But what makes it different than just like the properties of a physical surface is that that is a reality that is multidimensional in a sense, right? The reason why something might look different to me than it does to you is because all of those possibilities are in there in the thing. They're not just like fabricated by our minds to like give us something to look at. And
right.
that's my problem with people like Donald Hoffman and I think Bernardo Kastrup as well. I assume the Bernardo Kastrup fans in my audience will have a lot to say about that in the comments, but I'm pretty sure Kastrup would be with Hoffman on that. And I think there are a lot of people within the science world right now who are trying to step into this world of saying that consciousness is primary, but they're doing it in such a way that we end up locked inside of these prisons of subjectivity that we can't get out of. And I think that's a very real danger, just as much as it's a danger to see consciousness as just some kind of illusion spat out by meat computers or
Yeah.
whatever the physicalist way of describing it is these days.
Well, then I guess you get into that thing too of like, can consciousness be simulated? I don't think so, but yeah, I agree with you on that, and I'm probably guilty of maybe a little bit of hypocrisy because I don't know if my thinking is like um, completely in line with that idea because I do come from this materialist background. I still kind of am like this. I'm a kind of an empiricist because I've experienced this spiritual realm, so now that's part of my reality, and so now that's real to me. And but I'm still stuck in those modes of like materialism in the sense that like if there's a reason if you smell the candle and I smell the candle and we're smelling something different, it means that there's something different about our sensors. It doesn't mean that the candle doesn't have a smell intrinsically. It just means that our molecular, we have a molecular scanner inside our nose that is just translating the information differently in the same way that some people have a color blindness or whatever, and
Mm.
does that mean that green doesn't exist for that person if they can't see green? Well, no, I wouldn't say so, but again, it's like these are hard things to like to sort of think through to the end. But
Well, maybe that's a
that's
better, a more foundational thing to kind of hammer on than would be empiricism,
mhm,
because, the kind of physicalist scientism, they tend to wave the banner of empiricism, and they have absolutely no right to it in a lot of ways. A lot of modern science is as anti-empirical as it gets,
sure, yeah. Well,
just
there's like consensus,
completely
consensus.
fabricated.
This thing about consensus science kind of bugs me nowadays.
Right. But then there's the other side of that too, which is that this idea within the more spiritualistic or esoteric circles that empiricism is bad or like not enough or
Right.
something like that. And again, this is another way in which I consider myself to be carrying Rudolf Steiner's torch is, when he really considered himself to be a die-hard empiricist,
Okay.
because of the influence of Goethe, and it doesn't get more woo-woo than Rudolf Steiner, but nonetheless, he believed that like you should be able to see all of these things with your sensory faculties and supersensory faculties. He believed we have those too, but nonetheless, um, I think that's something very important to stick to. It's like we shouldn't just be accepting whatever ancient wisdom as necessarily true because the ancients said it and they were smart. So yeah, whatever. I mean, sometimes, yeah, in fact, a lot of the time, I think the ancients were definitely onto things that were extremely profound. But I also think it's a good idea to stick to your guns in that regard and really just be like, okay, that's cool, but I'll believe it when I see it. Because if you do that, then you can start to piece things together and start to see like why. You can be like,
Right.
okay, this is why
Bro.
the planets are the way they are, and this is why the zodiac is the way that it is, and this is why this and this and that happen within the story of Christ or,
Mhm.
whatever mythology you want to look at. I mean, it's all there is a very real underlying logic, and there's a very real there's a very real reality to these kind of spiritualistic processes in our world, and we can see them. We can see them with our own eyeballs, just the way that we can see um, the beauty in a painting or the sadness in a painting, or that we can hear it in music. I mean, these things are out there, and learning how to see them is not rejecting your experience and sinking into your own head, right? It's actually doing the opposite of that. It's actually learning to feel more deeply with our experiences and our senses.
Yeah, when you were saying that, like it just made me think of that was always my attitude about spirituality was like I'll believe it when I see it, and then I saw it.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
once I saw it, literally every single thing looked different, you know.
Oh
And
yeah.
to me that's like I'm still trying to get my brain around, you know, that process and the ultimate consequences of that because, and that was something I grew up hearing. One was one of my dad really liked to throw out these little quotes, and one of them was when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
Yep.
And that's exactly it. I mean,
Very true. Yeah.
even like you use the butterfly analogy, and I've used that cocoon analogy a lot in my own thinking about these processes that we're all going through, and I want to make a video about this cocoon thing and how it relates to the ego. I can never look at a cocoon the same way, and I can never look at any of these things the same way. And now there's like this, instead of it just being a physical thing that I can look up the definition for and read about in a science book, like there's these a sort of endless trail of correspondence and correlation that I now have access to that I just didn't even know existed. And it is like an entire world of meaning that was just invisible to me as an atheist. Um, and I guess that's the thing that still kind of lights me up. It's like, and even and it lit me up before, like a really good performance or a really good. I'm a really into music. I made music for a long time. I'm really into narratives. I love movies. Everything from sort of art house films up to the like Marvel movies and stuff. And so and to be able to now as more spiritually centered person, kind of have a whole new way to experience all these great things that just they light that inspiration. You feel the inspiration in your body, like it's an embodied reaction to like a good performance or to a good piece of music or whatever. Um, God is great. That's all.
Indeed. Yes. And
Like it's all.
I would add to that. I think music in particular. You could probably say this about all art in
Yeah.
different ways, but I think music in particular. My journeys of understanding philosophy, metaphysics, theology, all that good stuff, and music have kind of paralleled each other. But it's like the more I walk down either of those paths, the more they just end up being the same road. Like it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
they map onto each other.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not even map on. I wouldn't even say that. I mean, they kind of just end up being the same thing in a lot of ways. A lot of times when I'm talking about music, I stop and I think, wait, am I talking about music or am I talking about metaphysics? And then I'll do the
Right.
opposite, right? And
Right.
it's the thing about music that is so absolutely incredible is that it really does, and we would have to talk for another
Yeah.
three
Right.
hours to really unpack this. But I mean, to just put it in a nutshell, I mean, the basic structure of music is the basic structure of consciousness. I
Yeah.
mean, to put it really simply, like the basic dynamics of how a musical form grows and evolves and changes is how our inner emotional worlds do that as well, which is why we respond in the ways that we do. But it's also the way that like a cell like
Yeah.
becomes fertilized and then grows into an embryo, a blastula, and then like I mean it's all the same
Yeah.
basic motifs just recurring in different ways over and over
Yeah.
again, and that is just I mean, you just sit around and think about that for a minute and you're just like, damn, like
Yeah,
it's really incredible once you can see it,
yeah.
because again, like you said, like nothing is the same after that. It really
No.
changes everything. Yeah.
And I really love how you've in the Formscape stuff, you've sort of emphasized this relationship between the visible light spectrum and
Mhm.
and the musical scales. And excuse me, because that is how I see the chart. Is like it's like these are just the different aspects of what it means to to exist. But it's just it's the chart is like what happens when you put the light through the prism and you see these apparently discrete things, that make up this white light. I've sort of been this occurred to me recently. Like I'm not, I don't get into the flat Earth stuff, but I did start to try to imagine, just to try to conceptualize existence, um, with space. If you're looking at the chart, it's like space is on the right hand side, matter is on the left hand side.
Mhm.
Um, and you could imagine just as like you can look out into space and you can see what apparently is infinite space. I'm looking to the left side and I'm seeing like infinite matter, but it just because of gravity, it just happens to form into a sphere. Um,
Hmm.
but the way I was looking at it was more just about this thin, just like with the spectrum of visible light, it's just this razor thin part of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. The surface of the earth becomes this razor thin area where it's not too hot, it's not too cold, there's not too much space, there's not too much little space. It's this kind of Goldilocks zone of where things can happen, where all this is happening. And I started sort of correlating like that in the physical sense with light and then with music and vibration and all these things. And like yeah, like I could just sort of explore that endlessly. I don't even know if I understand what it means necessarily, but it does seem to be like a representation of like the order, like whatever can exist can only exist in this narrow spectrum in terms of human existence. Like I don't know about the spiritual side of things necessarily, but I suspect it's similar, and I think that that's what human life is sort of. I do believe that we have an eternal existence in the spirit realm, and I have my own reasons for believing that from my experience. But it did strike me that just as with on Earth, Earth, this realm, if you can call it a realm, is pretty unforgiving in a lot of ways. Too much heat, you die. Too much cold, you die. Not enough food, too much food, you die. Um, and so it does appear to be impressing this lesson upon us that that there's a way that things have to be, and that if you were to look at if it's true that we have an eternal existence, which I believe it is, then on an infinite timeline, um, small mistakes become catastrophic on an infinite timeline. Like you might be aiming for this thing, but if you're just off by a degree, it's not going to matter in 6 months. But in 60 years, it might really matter. If you're just off by this little thing. And so I have sort of started to conceptualize like life, whatever it is that we're experiencing, is trying to produce beings that can exist on an infinite timeline because they know the rules
Mhm.
and because we have achieved some amount of balance in between too much of this or too little of that or whatever it is.
I feel like
Um,
you're maybe referencing something kind of like the butterfly effect, right? Like you have a tiny error and that kind of explodes
uh,
exponentially over.
sure, to that degree, yeah. Like, just in the sense of like, yeah, actually, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I do have problems with the butterfly effect, in terms of what it's saying about chaos theory and these kind of things. But yeah, like if you're just off by a little bit, and I think that that's what again, and I don't want to get too deep into this because I don't necessarily know what I believe about Jesus at this point, but it does appear that because man has lost his way, and because we're not born with the type of software that say other animals are born with. Like other animals know what they are. Spider doesn't have to be taught by its mother how to spin a web. It just knows, you know, how to do these things. Um, and as you get closer to human type animals with mammals, you get closer and closer, especially with predators, you get closer and closer to this thing where you're born really not knowing anything. You're completely helpless, and then you have a culture that is then taking over for the biological instincts that would normally be there if we were just normal animals. And because of that fact, like if the culture you were brought up with is incorrect, if they're believing things that are not true and wise, if they're not in line with nature, then you're going to produce societies that do not survive. Because we have this nature where we're required to culturally absorb the proper software to run on the hardware. If the software is wrong, we got a serious problem. And to
Yes,
me,
no,
like,
that is a very serious consideration because um, certainly in the past, that was like there was a one-to-one correlation there. Like if your culture could not produce psychologically and physically healthy human beings, it just died.
yeah,
That was it. I mean, you
yeah,
got like one or two generations to correct an error, and if you didn't, it was over.
yeah,
But now we got a lot more wiggle room to fuck everything up, unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may
right,
be, because we have created a very unhealthy society in many ways. And yeah, I think this is our liquefying caterpillar in the chrysalis type
right,
moment because it in a way, in a lot of ways, modern capitalism, modern global techno, whatever the hell you want to call it, is kind of serving that purpose. It is allowing a completely it's serving as a cocoon. It's
yeah.
serving as
No,
something that can prevent our species from literally dying out as our culture goes through this breakdown so that it can reconfigure itself. And yeah, that's wild.
yeah.
Because
I mean,
yeah,
it's
under normal circumstances, we would all be dead. Absolutely. Like we would not have made it past the 20th century were it not for those fail safes of
yeah,
things like, international trade and industrial production and things like that. Because like I mean, man, can you imagine taking like 150 people from like your local community and having them go like, "Hey, survive in the wild, grow radishes, like
yeah, yeah,
protect yourselves from wolves and raiders." Like, there's no way. Absolutely no way. But again, I think this is serving a purpose. It's serving a purpose because I think we're in the process potentially of the awakening of a kind of planetary spirituality. I think that's what's happening. And it's one that I think is going to have a very different relationship to the idea of human freedom, which is something that we actually see very scarcely in traditional cultures and traditional religions. But it's something that has become a very, very major theme since the birth of modernity. And I think there's good reasons for that. But yeah, I mean, that is a whole other rabbit hole, which we should totally get
yeah,
into at some point. But
yeah.
my brain is totally fried. I think
No, I get it.
maybe it would be time to
Yeah,
start wrapping this up.
yeah,
Um,
man. I agree. And yeah, I actually have to eat dinner. I've not eaten. But
yeah, I probably need to take care of myself as well. That's a thing I'm always neglecting to do, which is
yeah.
why I would not survive in the woods. So
Well, I look
it,
forward to doing this again. And yeah, man, like I love your stuff, and I'm tuning in as much as I can. And props to you, and thanks for having me. You know,
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for coming on and
Mhm.
chatting with me. And of course, I'll put a link to your channel and send me a link to your TikTok as well because I have not
Cool.
even looked at that. And I'll put a
Okay.
link in the description and
Yeah, there's a
whatnot. But
couple other videos up there that I have not put on my YouTube if you're curious, and they're pretty short. So
okay, cool. Yeah, I'll totally check this out.
cool, man. All right.
All right.
All
Well,
right.
we'll leave it at that.
Sounds good,
And
man.
yeah.